The Other Westmore, Chapter 7, The Land That God Forgot, 1997. 5 minutes, the jumpmaster yelled from the front of a C-130 military aircraft. 5 minutes, my entire chalk of airborne candidates yelled back at him in the military's famous call-and-response cadence. We all knew what was next, and now we knew how long we had before it was time to face it. 5 minutes. I stood toward the middle of the C-130, staring at the back of another soldier's Kevlar helmet. The late summer Georgia heat beat down on the metal shell of the airplane that we'd been packed into for over an hour. Sweat that had been beading all over my face was now streaming uncontrollably, but afraid to move, I simply let it fall. The only relief came from the open door at the front of the plane that our instructors, the black hats we called them, occasionally looked out to inspect our drop zone. A black hat would brace his hands against each side of the door and stick his head into the open air, slowly turning from side to side to check for any potential obstacles. I had gotten used to the 50 pounds of gear cumbersomely strapped to my back, torso, and legs. My bladder verged on explosion because of the crazy amount of water we were forced to drink to stay hydrated. None of this now mattered. I was about to jump out of the plane. I was about to become a paratrooper. An excited nervousness overwhelmed me. It had been a little more than a year since I decided to make the Army a fundamental part of my future. As my high school career was coming to an end, I was still being avidly recruited by college programs. The New York Times had even run a 2-page article on my high school sports career and future prospects. I got a first-hand taste of the athletic campus visitation process, complete with young and attractive tour guides who showed me around and made me feel welcome and wanted. It was a seductive ego stroke. Initially, it just reinforced my belief that I was special, that I was chosen. The young female admirers who seemed to come along with the package added to the allure. But eventually, all these treats started to feel meaningless. As I began to play against nationally ranked players at various tournaments and camps, I realized that the disparity between my potential and theirs was glaring. I played hard while they played easy, with a gracefulness and effortlessness that I lacked. When you step on the court with players like Kobe Bryant or 6'8" point guards who can dunk from the free throw line, your mind begins to concentrate on your other options. I realized that I had to make sure that these schools knew my name regardless of what I did on the 90 feet of hardwood that had brought me to their attention. Just as military school had slowly grown on me, so had academic life. I actually liked reading now. My mother, sensing my apathy towards reading, had bought me the Mitch Albom book Fab Five. The book is about the Michigan basketball team led by Chris Webber, Jalen Rose, and Juan Howard, a team with 5 freshman starters who made it all the way to the national championship game. The Fab Five sported baggy shorts, bald heads, and a swagger I recognized from the streets of the Bronx, all reflective of the way that the hip-hop generation was changing the face of sports and college basketball in particular. I was riveted by that book. The characters jumped off the page, and I felt myself as engulfed in their destiny as I was in my own. I finished Fab Five in 2 days. The book itself wasn't what was important. In retrospect, I see that it was a great read, but hardly a great work of literature. But my mother used it as a hook into a deeper lesson, that the written word isn't necessarily a chore, but it can be a window into new worlds. From there, I leaped into every new book with fervor. My fresh love of reading brought me to the transformative writers who have worked their magic on generations of readers. I explored Spain with Paulo Coelho. I listened to jazz on the North Shore of Long Island with F. Scott Fitzgerald. I was reminded by Walt Whitman to think of more of the past, and I awaited The Fire Next Time with James Baldwin. But there was a more recent author and public figure whose work spoke to the core of a new set of issues I was struggling with. The Bronx's own Colin Powell. His book, My American Journey, helped me harmonize my understanding of America's history and my aspiration to serve her in uniform. In his autobiography, he talked about going to Woolworth's in Columbus, Georgia, and being able to shop but not eat there. He talked about how black GIs during World War II had more freedoms when stationed in Germany than back in the country that they had fought for. But he embraced the progress this nation made and the military's role in helping that change to come about. Colin Powell would have been justifiably angry, but he wasn't. He was thankful. I read and reread one section in particular. The Army was living the democratic ideal ahead of the rest of America. Beginning in the 50s, less discrimination, a truer merit system, and a leveler playing field existed inside the gates of our military posts more than in any southern city hall or northern corporation. The Army, therefore, made it easier for me to love my country with all of its flaws and to serve her with all of my heart. The canon of Black autobiography sensibly includes scores of books about resistance to the American system. For instance, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, a book that begins and ends in the madness and pathology of America's racial obsessions, is a rite of passage for young Black men. Malcolm never stopped pursuing truth and the right course, based on the best information he had at any given moment. His response to the world he confronted in the middle of the 20th century was profound and deeply felt, but he didn't speak to my experience as well as Colin Powell did. Powell, in his pragmatic way, wanted what I wanted, a fair shot, a place to develop himself, a code that would instill discipline, restrain passion, and order his steps, a way to change the world without first unleashing the whirlwind. In the chaos of the world I grew up in, those were as appealing to me as Malcolm's cry for revolution was to his generation. I don't claim that Powell had it all figured out. American history bedevils the most earnest attempts to make sense of it. And of course, the problems of race that Malcolm confronted have not disappeared by any means. But Powell gave me another way to think about the American dilemma, and more than that, another way to think about my own life. As I started to think seriously about how I could become the person I wanted to be, I looked around at some of the people who had the biggest impact on my life. Aside from family and friends, the men I most trusted all had something in common. They all wore the uniform of the United States of America. I thought about Lieutenant Colonel Murnane, my 10th and 11th grade history and social studies teacher, who lit a fire in me about the importance of public service. I sat in the front of his class entranced as he spoke about the Constitutional Congress, the Federalist Papers, and their relevance to our existence today. I thought about Rear Admiral Hill, the former superintendent of the Naval Academy, who served as the president of Valley Forge in my last 3 years of high school. Admiral Hill had thousands of cadets, faculty, staff, alumni, and trustees to deal with on a daily basis, but he always made a point to know the names and stories of as many cadets as he could. He also taught me an important lesson about leadership. It always comes with having to make tough decisions. I thought about Colonel Billy Murphy, the commandant of cadets. He was one of the most intimidating but fair men I have ever met. He and his command sergeant major, Harry Harris, demanded excellence from every unit, every platoon, and every cadet. They believed that excuses were tools of the incompetent and forced every cadet to believe the same. One of the last times I saw Colonel Murphy was in our chapel. I sat toward the front. The hard wooden pews forced us to sit up straight, and the message coming from the pulpit demanded everyone's attention. Colonel Murphy ascended to the podium, looking as strong as ever, his eyes still alit with a sense of purpose. Then he announced that he was leaving Valley Forge to undergo treatment for his advanced stage cancer. He said something that I will never forget. When it is time for you to leave this school, leave your job, or even leave this earth, you make sure that you worked hard to make sure it mattered that you were ever here. The notion that life is transient, that it can come and go quickly, unexpectedly, had been with me since I had seen my own father die. In the Bronx, the idea of life's impermanence underlined everything for kids my age. It drove some of us to paralyzing apathy, stopped us from even thinking too far into the future. Others were driven to what, in retrospect, was a sort of permanent state of mourning for our loved ones who always seemed at risk, and for our own lives, which felt so fragile and vulnerable. But I started to see it a little differently that day. Life's impermanence, I realize, is what makes every single day so precious, and what shapes our time here. It's what makes it so important that not a single moment be wasted. My next decision was clear. I wanted to stay at Valley Forge and attend its junior college, which would allow me to go through the early commissioning process, receive my associate's degree, and become a second-hand lieutenant in the Army. I wanted to lead soldiers. 3 minutes, the black hat yelled out. 3 minutes, we replied with a good deal less gusto. I looked around the plane at the faces of my fellow prospective paratroopers. U.S. Army Airborne School is a collection of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, cadets, and anyone else who has received the funding and possesses the will to become airborne qualified. Some of the attendees needed the qualification to advance in their careers. For example, those planning to join a Ranger battalion or one of the elite Army units like the 82nd Airborne Division needed to be qualified as paratroopers. For some attendees whose career goals didn't involve combat, it was a way to get a taste of what the combat experience feels like. For all of us, however, it was, at this moment, terrifying. For some in my chalk, this was the first genuine military activity that they would engage in. For a few, this was the first airplane ride they had ever taken. These few, even after today, still wouldn't have had the experience of landing in an airplane, just taking off and jumping out. Broad smiles and hollow laughter were undermined by trembling legs and shaking hands. Our sweat-stained uniforms, still dusty from the endless push-ups and practice jump landings in man-made pits overflowing with sawdust from our first week, clung to our skin. My left hand grasped the yellow ripcord for dear life as my right hand pressed against the side wall of the C-130 for balance. That bright yellow cord was my lifeline. If it failed, the reserve parachute that strapped to my belly like a baby kangaroo would be my last hope. A week before I boarded the most memorable plane ride of my life, Valley Forge had selected me to be the regimental commander for the 70th Corps of Cadets. This meant that I would be the highest-ranking cadet in the entire Corps of over 700 people. I would be responsible for their training, health, welfare, morale, and success. I remembered watching the regimental commander my first year at Valley Forge with simultaneous fear and awe. On his command, the entire Corps moved. Wherever he stepped on campus, cadets snapped to attention. Every cadet possessed a burning desire to be recognized, but never noticed, as his piercing blue eyes evaluated his corps. Now, days after I became a qualified paratrooper, I would take on that role. The plane steadied as we neared our drop zone. At 1,800 feet in the air, the large aircraft began to cruise and prepare to offload its 20 aspirants. I was only 18 years old, the youngest in my chalk. When I was commissioned, less than a year from that moment, I was told that I was one of the youngest officers in the entire United States military. My platoon sergeant would probably be older than my mother. My company commander would probably have over a decade of life on me. It was one thing leading cadets, but would I honestly be ready at such a young age to lead soldiers? My mind began racing when a command brought me back to reality. 1 minute, 1 minute. My mind retraced my 3 weeks of training in 15 seconds and remembered the components of landing. When I landed, I needed to make sure that my feet and knees stayed together, that my eyes stayed focused on an object in the distance, not on the ground, and that my 5 points of contact hit the ground in order: balls of my feet, sides of my calves, hips, lats, and shoulders. It seemed much easier than it actually is. Jumping from a plane the wrong way or landing the wrong way could lead to serious injuries, even the kind after which you can't tell war stories the next day. Step out with one leg, chin tight against my chest, right hand on the handle of the reserve parachute. Do I count to 2? Do I count to 3 or count to 4 before pulling my reserve? Which way do I pull my parachute slips if the wind is blowing left or right? Damn, I can't remember. Is that minute up yet? My mind and my nerves were on edge. The black hats yelling, "Get ready, airborne," brought me back to task. Our black hats always told us to remember 3 things as we were dropping: trust your equipment, trust your training, and trust your God. As we were seconds away from taking the leap, the multitude of prayers that left the plane were palpable. I stared at the yellow light at the front of the plane, waiting for it to turn green. I spoke with God, asking him to watch over me and the others in the plane. The excessively hot and cramped conditions, coupled with the fact that some of the toughest schools in the military take place at Fort Benning, have earned the base the nickname "the land that God forgot." I was hoping that he'd remember us today. The formalities that usually accompanied my prayers, "Dear most heavenly Father and most gracious and everlasting God," were replaced with very simple, blunt, and direct requests like "help, and please don't let me die like this." But before I could even finish my prayer, the yellow light disappeared and a bright green one lit up right above it. Green light, go. The soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors, Coast Guardmen, cadets, and everyone else in front of me began to shuffle their feet toward the door. It reminded me of commuters leaving a packed subway car, an odd resonance as I approached the open door, 2,000 feet in the air. We had heard stories during training about people who, after the black hat yelled "green light go," had tried to stay in the plane. They were lifted off of their feet by the jumpmasters and thrown out to keep the flow of bodies moving in rhythm and to make sure all of us landed in the drop zone and not in somebody's yard somewhere in Alabama. I shuffled my feet toward the door as the population of the aircraft methodically decreased. My colleagues, I realized, were all now flying through the air beneath me. Suddenly, the only person in front of me was the jumpmaster. He stared at me. We were so close that I could see my distorted reflection in his large Ray-Bans. His cheeks were flapping from the wind blowing against his face. I handed him my yellow ripcord, yelled, "Airborne, jumpmaster," and turned my body to face the open door. I closed my eyes and felt the air just below me flying by. I assumed the proper position, and somehow my left leg stepped out over the edge of the doorway. Instantly, my entire body was sucked out of the plane, and I felt the aircraft speed away. I thrashed around in the wind. It wasn't me who controlled my movements, but the air rushing around me. I rotated in darkness because I refused to open my eyes. I was counting in my mind, as I was instructed to, and as I hit the longest 3 seconds of my life, I felt a sudden jerk, and my body was lifted dozens of feet when my main parachute automatically opened. With that tug, I finally opened my eyes, looked up, and to my relief, saw a perfectly symmetrical and hole-free canopy above me. I felt a cocktail of beautiful emotions coursing through me: peace, love, appreciation. I looked down at the trees waving in the distance and the gorgeous brown Alabama soil that seemed to be rising to meet me. My equipment was functional, my training was sound, my faith confirmed. I cut through the sky, the wind whipping against my face as I kept my eyes high, staring intently at the horizon.